If you're here, you already sense there's something out there, something magical and mysterious, just waiting for you to find. And you've probably already discovered it isn't as easy as just thinking happy thoughts. You're not alone. Generations of shamans, philosophers, seers, and scientists have pursued this eternal quest. Where their ideas come together, you'll find powerful tools to cultivate magic and self-mastery in your own life. Welcome to the Magic and Mastery Podcast. I'm your host, Donna Woodwell. I'm a former journalist and author, a master astrologer, and a hermetic initiate, and it's my honor to be your guide. In each episode, I'll meet you at the crossroads of science and spirit, reason and intuition, to help you discover the wisdom that works for you. Are you ready? The adventure awaits. Hello, and welcome to the Magic and Mastery Podcast. This is episode 008 on Tarot and Shadows. Now, you may remember in the last episode, I mentioned 5 tips for helping you to bring your own shadow to light. Well, one of my listeners wrote in and reminded me of a 6th tool that I didn't mention. And it made me smile because I figured she must be one of those psychic listeners. You know who you are, so thanks for keeping me on my toes. But in this case, I actually intentionally left that one out because I wanted to do an entire episode on the topic. And that mystery tool? It's using tarot or other divination tools to help you explore your own shadow. So before we talk about that, just remember, as always, to make it easier to refer back to the bits you're looking for in this episode, we've added headings and timestamps to the show notes. You'll find those at www.magicandmastery.com/podcast. And of course, one more thing, I always have an experiment that you can try out for yourself at the end of the episode, so you can see how the magic works for you. But enough of that. Let's get started. Why am I making this a separate episode? Well, because there's so much confusion out there about what divination is and what it isn't that I thought a little more time to talk about it would be useful. You see, I grew up in the American suburbs in the 70s, so I got a front row seat on why divination is such a shadowy, misunderstood thing in pop culture. On the one hand, I had this vague sense that tarot cards, astrology, Ouija boards all went with mood rings and hippies. And so they were something only silly, superstitious people took seriously. On the other hand, such things popped up in horror movies with dire consequences. So in our culturally Christian society, there's this vague unease with strange occult symbols. Demons or evil forces lurk on the edges of our worldview. So there's actually 2 strikes against divination. 1, it's silly and doesn't work. Or it's satanic and leads to evil. If you think about it, those 2 worldviews are actually logically inconsistent with one another. I mean, believing in lurking evil demons is just as superstitious as believing in Ouija boards. But it's astonishing how many people still let both beliefs linger side by side in the back of their mind spaces without thinking about them too much. But that's the power of shadow. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to the point. What exactly is divination? Well, a literal definition might be a technique for exploring the mind of the divine. A broader definition might be this. It's using any tool or technique in order to explore what's hidden, whether it be in the shadows of the human psyche, or communication with spirit beings, foretelling the future, or understanding what happened in the past. In fact, that's what occult means. It just means hidden or to hide. So, already you can see how divination can make some folks a little uneasy. It's seeking information about the unknown. And for many people, mystery is a scary thing. What lurks in the dark, beyond the circle of light cast by our campfire of consciousness, can seem frightening, especially when we aren't used to working with our shadowy bits. And anything that can be interpreted symbolically can be used as a divination tool, and for that matter, probably has been. So go ahead, ask yourself a yes or no question. Flip a coin. Let's say heads for yes and tails for no. There, you've done it. You've taken your first step toward being a seer. That wasn't so scary now, was it? Of course, life's more complex than simple black and white yes and no questions. And so humans have developed myriad tools to help answer more complex questions. Some tools are primarily dedicated for divination. And that's things like Ouija boards and oracle decks. Though I admit, my first Ouija board became a plank that held my desk together in college. I actually kind of wish I kept it because now I realize it was a vintage Ouija board. And of course, don't forget fortune cookies. Those are probably the #1 most common divination tool, followed closely by astrology horoscope columns. But lots of everyday items work too, like our aforementioned coin toss, or even a playing card deck. Even Google. I remember when Google added "I'm feeling lucky" to its main search page. I was like, look, it's Googlemancy. That's divination via Google. Anyway, I looked it up at the time, and there was one website that used the term Googlemancy. Now you look it up, and there are thousands of hits. And then, of course, any book can be used for divination. In fact, the Bible is one of the most popular tools for Christian divination. If you've ever picked up a Bible and flipped to a random page for advice from God, then you are no longer a divination virgin. Sorry to burst your bubble. Of course, thanks to the New Age movement, there's been an enormous proliferation of divination tools, packaged into gift boxes with little white booklets to help you get started fast. Now I know divination isn't quite that simple. It takes some practice to cultivate a divination attitude, which leads to useful information gathering with such tools. Still, even without a lot of frills, a well-designed divination tool can feel like it's tapping into something deep and timeless. And tarot has got to be one of the best examples of a well-designed divination tool. And so the next logical question is, why? What exactly is tarot? And where did it come from? Well, in essence, tarot decks began life as a card game for the rich and trendy of the Italian Renaissance. At the time, our familiar playing card deck was still a new arrival from the Arab world. And those with time on their hands were still imagining what games they could create to play with the new deck. And in the early part of the 1400s, someone likely came up with the idea of creating a 5th suit for the deck. These extra cards were used in a trick-taking card game, something not unlike bridge, known in Italian as tarocchi. The cards themselves were modeled on a triumphal procession of virtues. Such ideas were made popular in early Renaissance literature and appeared in Mardi Gras-like parades. We'll get back to this in a moment. And while today's cultural creatives may be known for what kind of dumb thing you can post on YouTube to see if it will go viral, the Renaissance was a slightly slower time. The cool Renaissance kids made art. We still remember some of their names today: Da Vinci, Michelangelo, Botticelli, Raphael. They adorned ceilings and walls, created sculptures, fountains, architecture, and more. Of course, no socially prosperous, wealthy family would have been without their own official court artist to paint portraits of family members and to oversee the artistic development of the family properties. Now, the court artist for the Visconti Sforza family, Bonifacio Bembo, was commissioned to create a tarocchi deck for the family, featuring portraits of family members on the different cards. The beautiful illuminated deck was most likely used as a status symbol rather than put into daily use to play the game, and hence we still have the beautiful cards preserved today. But this was just one example of the game, and the images on the cards were so compelling that when the French invaded northern Italy in the early 1500s, they brought the game home with them. The card-making factories of Marseille churned out the first mass-produced decks, which then spread through Europe. It really wasn't until the 18th century when occultists started popularizing using tarot as a divination tool, most likely because they intuitively understood what the trump cards represented. In essence, they're a pictorial guide to one of the central ideas of the Western esoteric and spiritual traditions, what scholars have sometimes called the myth of descent and return. What's that, you ask? Well, in a nutshell, it's the idea that we are all divine beings having a human experience, and that our highest calling is to reconnect with our divine origins. Hence the descent from the divine and the return to the divine, the myth of descent and return. And it's this myth and all of its forms that's pervasive in Western religion, spirituality, storytelling, and art. It's the kernel at the heart of the hero's journey. And it's the basis for the three great models of the Western esoteric traditions. That's astrology, alchemy, and Kabbalah. And the mythos was even adopted by early Christians to create a new religion, which really wasn't new at all, just rebranding a very old story. But this allegory is far more than just a metaphysical idea. It's also a profoundly psychological insight about how things change and grow. It goes like this. In the beginning, things are shiny and new and exciting. But as we continue to grow, we realize things don't quite fit us anymore, and cracks begin to appear, and eventually things fall apart and die before new understanding is reborn from the ashes. And then we are shining and new again, and the whole cycle, it repeats itself again and again. In astrology, day leads to night, and then back to day again. Summer leads to winter, and then back to summer. In alchemy, the rubedo follows the negredo. In Kabbalah, Kepher becomes Malkut, seeking to return to Kepher. An endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Now, whoever designed the original tarot decks realized that this myth was central to all of these streams of Renaissance thought. Astrology, alchemy, Kabbalah, and yes, even Christianity. That they could use the commonalities to create a representation of the process in a pictorial form. One step leading to the next, like the 22 steps along the Western path to enlightenment. And this is exactly why tarot makes such an epic divination tool. When you ask a question, the tarot cards respond by pointing out how whatever you are asking about fits into this cycle of descent and return. Is it new and exciting? Or is it falling apart? Or is it being reborn and understood in a new way? And so by now, I'm sure you can imagine why tarot is such a great tool for doing shadow work. Things may be hidden from your view, but they still follow the same natural laws. And tarot, like working with dreams, can provide you with images that give form to what's happening in the shadowy depths through a process that the psychologist Carl Jung called synchronicity. Plus, tarot can give you ideas on how to effectively respond to what's going on in the shadowy depths. And even more than that, you can also get a sense of how you feel about such things by how you respond to the images that a tarot spread shows you. If an image makes you angry, afraid, nervous, or even elated, you know it's probably tapping into something in your own shadow that you've got to work through to help bring it to light. Now, working with tarot doesn't have to be hard or even done by mysterious candlelight. You can just have a conversation with it, as you would a good friend. Here's an experiment you can try out for yourself if you have your own tarot deck at hand. And if you don't, I highly recommend you pick one up. The Rider-Waite-Smith deck is usually the gateway deck, so you can find a link to it in this week's show notes. Anyway, let's keep our experiment super simple. Think of a question. It could be anything. Insights on a relationship, ideas for your career, suggestions on how to spend your time during a pandemic. Really, the list is endless. Get out a piece of paper and write down your question at the top of the paper. Now, shuffle your deck and pull a card. If tarot is new to you, it's okay to look up the meaning in the little white book that came with the deck. It's like using training wheels. But it's also okay just to contemplate the picture on the card and see what that picture evokes for you. Now, write down whatever seems important as a response to your first question. And now, choose an aspect of the response that you'd like to explore in more detail. You could say something like, "So, what do you mean by this image? Can you tell me more?" Write that question down next on your piece of paper. And then, pull another card and do the same thing. Write down whatever seems most important from that response. And if you still feel like you need more clarification, pull another card and repeat the process all over again. And when you get good at it, it's kind of like having a conversation with a friend, only they respond in pictures instead of in words. But given that tarot decks have 72 cards, and that's not including it if you double the number by considering cards that are upside down as a separate thing, specifically indicating shadows or blocked energy. Really, the conversations can be incredibly rich and evocative. So, it's no surprise that people want to start investigating everything in their lives with the help of tarot. If you're honest with yourself and keep track of your notes, over time, you will get a feel for how your tarot sleuthing manifests in practical, real-life ways. It can even help you move through the shadowed blocks that otherwise might take years to work through with conventional therapy. I wish someone had explained tarot to me like this in the beginning, because it took me a long time to figure out how to fit it into my other shamanic and magical practices. Now I realize I just lacked context for what I was looking at. I had picked up one of the hundreds of modern decks that don't really dive into the big picture of what tarot is. And so I never really found tarot compelling and ended up giving the deck that I had away. And it wasn't until a dozen or more years into my metaphysical studies that I looked back at tarot again. And the second time, I understood instantly what it was. And I was like, why didn't somebody explain it to me that way in the first place? I could have started my magical studies with this. And that's one of the things that makes tarot so amazing. It makes a fantastic introduction to the Western magical tradition. Now it seems fitting that my first official course from my magic school is on tarot and its secret magical roots, and how by knowing them, you'll not only master this brilliant divination tool, you'll also understand its ancient wisdom for living a creative and empowered life. You can find out more about my new tarot course in the show notes at www.magicandmastery.com/podcast. And if you act now, you will get nearly 50% off the regular price. The price will never be this low again. So, if you want to study the magical art of tarot with me, now's the best time. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of Magic and Mastery with me, your host, Donna Woodwell. As I've said before, I love getting feedback. It really does help me know what makes you jazzed so I can provide more of the good stuff. So it would mean so much to me if you take a moment to rate and review the podcast. And if you like it, why don't you share it with a friend?